smaller group called Barbary Coast. These few blocks were long on action and short on law and order. In memoirs written years later, some people recall it as a slice of heaven, while others remember it as the order of hell.
I have seen purer liquors, better cigars. Here in San Francisco, than any place I've ever visited.
Every nationality on the high card.
Fort Point was completed in 1861. Stood guard over the narrow mouth of the bay, protecting San Francisco's vital port from California's immense and silver against
Load and fire a Civil War cannon. We are approaching the Golden Gate Bridge. Many Golden Gate Bridge is simple. Construction began in 1933. The design was final. I took to the most graceful object, the tower at the San Francisco Bridge. Then look down at the concrete foundation of the tower. This was the first great chest. Nothing of concrete carried water more than 100 feet deep. An enormous temporary wall. Enclosing an area in the bay the size of it. Water was pumped out. Concrete. Next came the two towers. They were complete. Road itself. become a symbol of America's hope, as inspiring and recognizable as the Statue of Liberty.
When you're standing on that deck, you can feel it vibrate. You can feel it sway back and forth. The entire bridge hums like a harpsichord. And it makes you feel very small. And standing, looking up at those huge towers and listening to the whole thing moaning in the wind, awe-inspiring.
That name, by the way, came long before the bridge.
In heavy fog, in the early morning hours, the Rio de Janeiro struck the rocks. The ship did not have watertight bulkheads, and it sank in a mere 10 minutes. Many of the 210 passengers and crew were below decks and couldn't escape. 128 lives were lost. The sea can be dangerous, but you might be grateful that we are out on the water right now, because one thing San Francisco is famous for is surviving earthquakes. Look at the city skyline. The Great Quake of 1906 began at 12 minutes past 5 a.m. on April 18th, when the earth rumbled and rolled and knocked San Francisco flat. In 1906, the quake was bad. The real disaster was the fire that followed. Look at the pointed spiral of the Transamerica Pyramid near downtown. Imagine that entire area engulfed in flames. And not just a fire, a firestorm. It burned for 3 days and 2 nights. By the time the fire burned itself out, much of San Francisco's once proud downtown was little more than rubble. 28,000 buildings had been destroyed. 250,000 people were homeless. Tens of thousands of San Franciscans lived for months in tents while the city was rebuilt. Damage was awesome. But in just 3 years, 20,000 new buildings were built, and San Francisco was back on its feet again. Its citizens knew that their city could survive just about anything. The Great Quake of 1906, San Francisco's worst earthquake, was certainly not the first, and unfortunately, not the last. Look out the windows toward the city and the Marina District. The earth shook again in October 1989, and it was the Marina District that suffered the greatest damage in that quake. The man-made land reclaimed from the bay rolled like ocean waves, and buildings collapsed into rubble. Stuart Brand was driving his car there when the earthquake struck.
Just happened to be driving down Marina Boulevard. Suddenly I thought the steering wheel got out of the car as I was swimming from lane to lane.
After the gold rush, San Francisco grew into a cosmopolitan city. with impressive mansions, grand theaters, and elegant hotels. But the spirit of the first settlers still echoes in the area's Spanish place names, names such as San Francisco for one, and there's Tiburon, which is Spanish for shark. Even the name Alcatraz comes from the Spanish name for pelicans, Los Alcatraces. We're passing another place with a name that came from the Spanish. Over to the left is the island the Spanish call La Isla de Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles, the island of Our Lady of the Angels. Nowadays, we just call it Angel Island. 2,000 years ago, Angel Island was home to the Miwok Indians. The Miwok lived a good life on a small island paradise, hunting in the island's forests and fishing in the bay. Later, the Spanish used it as a military base, and later still, the U.S. Army set up shop. Its open spaces are lined with hiking and bicycling trails, and it is once again an island paradise in the middle of the bay. You can visit it today by taking a blue and gold fleet ferry. But there's another chapter in Angel Island's history that began in the late 1800s, when the United States government built an immigration center on the island. Angel Island became the Ellis Island of the West. For more than 50 years, thousands of Asian immigrants passed through Angel Island. Many of them were held on the island until they could prove that they had relatives already living in the United States.
My name is John Gino Chin. I came here in 1924. I went to the island, what they call Angel Island.
The immigrants were questioned for hours, and their answers were compared with statements made by other family members.
First, they asked my names, my parents' names, and brothers and sisters, and later on they asked about the house, how many doors, how many windows.
The price of a wrong answer was deportation. But today, the old detention center
Hi.
houses a museum,
How you doing?
a monument
Yeah.
to
Are you
San
okay?
Francisco's Asian immigrants, men and women who fought their way past legal barriers and racial prejudice to enjoy America's promise of a brighter future.
Boats. I see boats.
The one and only Alcatraz Island. It's directly ahead. Once, the only creatures that lived on that barren rock were flocks of pelicans. In fact, that's where Alcatraz got its name. The Spanish named the island after the pelicans, Los Alcatraces. The U.S. Army decided Alcatraz Island was the perfect place for a fort to defend the bay from invaders. But this cold and windy rock was such an unpleasant place that they changed their minds. It was now the perfect place for a military prison, and eventually a federal penitentiary. It was a time when gangsters were becoming heroes to people. The government needed to send a message that crime did not pay, so they created Alcatraz, the very last stop in the country's prison system, the place to send the worst criminals of all.
Yeah, my name is Leon Whitey Thompson. My number was 1465, AZ 1465.
Listen carefully now. You're about to hear from former inmates, guards, and residents of The Rock, to tell you their stories themselves.
I was a man that had total hatred in them days. I hated anything that walked the crawl on this earth. And when you got a man like that in prison, you got to get rid of him. And that's what they did. They shipped me to Alcatraz.
These were hard men, kidnappers, bank robbers, killers, men so dangerous that when the first batch arrived by train in 1934, not one was allowed to step down onto free soil. They simply loaded the train cars, one by one, onto barges, and floated them out to the island with the inmates chained up inside. Rumor was that if a man died on Alcatraz, his corpse would leave the same way, stone cold dead, but in chains. With men like these, you could never be too careful. The building you see on top of the hill was the inmate's new home, the Alcatraz cell house. One described it as a tomb of living souls. Some would stay for a year, others for 20 or 25 years or more. To get an idea of the accommodations inside, go ahead and reach your arms out as far as you can from side to side. That's how wide an Alcatraz cell is, only 5 feet across. Now reach your hands up high above your head. That's how tall, and only a bit longer from end to end. The cell house might look huge from here, but it was never completely filled. No more than 300 inmates lived inside at any time. 300. They could all fit on this boat ride today. Notice the circular water tower. Alcatraz is surrounded by water, but on the island itself, not a drop. Fresh water had to come from San Francisco, and not by any pipeline. 2 or 3 times a week, a barge arrived, full of 180,000 gallons of fresh water. It was pumped up into that tank. The tall smokestack marks the Alcatraz powerhouse. One thing that couldn't be brought out here by boat was electricity, so they made their own. One young man was only 21 years old when he first climbed onto the Rock. His name was Frank Heaney, and he was a guard. In fact, the youngest guard ever to serve on Alcatraz.
I had a very difficult time. They really took advantage of my age. The old saying that misery loves company, they were very miserable, so they like to make you miserable too. They had no tailor-made cigarettes, they had no candy bars, chewing gum, soft drinks, radios, television, newspapers, rolls, or rehabilitation programs. They had none of that when being sent to Alcatraz.
Men sent to Alcatraz considered themselves the elite among convicts.
But on the Rock, I'm not trying to put a feather in my hat or none, but they had a lot of class.
You could say they were a higher caliber of criminal. They were more or less professionals, people who robbed mail trucks and banks and so forth. Some were in for murder. They were a cut above average, the average criminal.
Robert Strout, the Birdman, Al Capone, Nicky Cohen, Frankie Garbo, Machine Gun Kelly. They're just another stupid fool like I was. And that's the way most of the other cons felt about, because everybody was the same on the Rock.
Nobody learned that faster than Alphonse Big Al Capone, Mr. Scarface himself. Capone ruled like a king in any other prison, but here on the Rock, he mopped floors just like anybody else. With no one to protect him, Capone was a sitting duck. The big man was roughed up, beaten, and even stabbed. But Capone had carried his real killer with him to Alcatraz. A case of untreated syphilis was eating his brain and slowly driving him insane. He ended up locked in the bug cage, the fenced-off section of the hospital for mental patients. Still the tough guy, Capone fought with his ward mate, not with guns or knives, but with bedpans, full bedpans. Afterwards, the once mighty crime czar had to be washed off with a hose. Look up ahead at the 3-story guards barracks above the landing dock. You'll also see a metal frame tower at the right corner of the dock.
The tower that you see in front of us is the dock tower It was manned 24 hours a day. It had a large group of weapons, had a 30-06 rifle, 30 caliber rifle, tear gas gun, 38 revolver. Men were shot and killed from the tower.
One officer would sit up on the top of that tiny tower, 75 feet above the island, locked in for 8 hours at a time, watching, just watching, no matter what kind of weather.
Sometimes you thought you were in heaven. When the fog would come in, you could hardly see.
George DiVincenzi was an Alcatraz guard in the 50s.
I was in the dock tower the day that they closed the Golden Gate Bridge. They had over 100-mile-an-hour gales, and I'm on that dock tower, and that was swinging and swaying like Sandy Kay's music. The water in the commode was spinning around, the tower was shaking, and I says, my God, if this goes over, I'm gonna end up in a bay, locked up in this cage.
On the walls of the guards' barracks, you can still see writing from the Indian occupation of 1969 to 1971. Look for the words Indian Land and Indians Welcome. A group of 89 Native Americans claimed the island and held out here for 2 years. Historian John Martini is here to explain what happened.
They claimed Alcatraz under an old treaty that said that male members of the Great Sioux Nation could homestead unused excess federal property. The first time in nearly a century when Indians of all tribes had gathered together for a common purpose.
In the end, the Indians were forced off the island. They were probably the only inhabitants of Alcatraz ever to leave unwillingly. Up the hill, you can see a partially destroyed building with open, empty windows. This was once a luxurious Spanish mission-style mansion, home to the Alcatraz warden. It burned in a fire that broke out during the Indian occupation. All that is left is this battered shell. Looking at these cliffs passing by, you can get a close-up view of why Alcatraz is called the Rock. When the army first arrived, the island was so barren that there weren't even any plants. There wasn't any dirt for them to grow in. Soil had to be imported here from Angel Island before anything bloomed on the rock. It did.
Moon.
Now if you look ahead, you'll see the Bay Bridge, which crosses from San Francisco to Oakland. Opened in 1936, the Bay Bridge is really two bridges in one, and together they span 8.5 miles across the bay. You can see the design differences quite clearly. Look at the section that connects Yerba Buena Island to San Francisco. The massive concrete pier in the center of the suspension bridge rises 200 feet above the water. It connects to a foundation of bedrock 200 feet below the surface. Above and below water, that pier is more massive than the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt, and it contains more concrete than the Empire State Building. The tunnel through Yerba Buena Island is the largest diameter transportation bore tunnel in the world. The Bay Bridge received international attention when a section of the roadway collapsed during the 1989 earthquake. That section was part of the older cantilever that connects to Oakland on the other side of Yerba Buena Island. It is here you can see the new bridge design. This eastern portion of the bridge is the largest self-anchored suspension bridge in the world. The central tower rises 525 feet into the air and is designed to withstand a magnitude 8.5 earthquake. The new eastern span of the Bay Bridge cost more than $6 billion to install, but is part of a vital link between Oakland and San Francisco. It turns more than 300,000 automobiles per day. Now look at the low, flat island connected to Yerba Buena Island at the middle of the bridge. That's Treasure Island. It's an artificial island that was built as a site for the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition World's Fair. Back in 1850, long before the Bay Bridge was built, it was said that there were so many ships anchored in the bay that you could walk from San Francisco to East Bay without getting your feet wet. Many of those ships were abandoned, eventually being burned, sunk, filled over, and used as landfill in downtown San Francisco.
We don't need that broken
head back, we will soon approach our final destination. One of the most famous attractions in San Francisco, Pier 39. Locals and visitors from around Europe come to Pier 39 for world-class dining and spectacular view. On the left, you can look close. You might see their shiny black heads in the wind. Over the years, the group has felt the open sound of the sea. Visitors to Pier and when it looks up Christmas, see how we get on. When we sail right past them, they become the river. Cameron's ready. Thank you for visiting, and enjoy your stay.